Picture this: the year is 1683, and the city of Vienna stands as the last great barrier between two mighty empires. The air is thick with smoke, the ground trembles beneath the weight of charging cavalry, and the fate of Europe hangs in the balance. This was the Siege of Vienna, a clash that would echo through the centuries, not just as a battle, but as a defining moment where courage, strategy, and sheer willpower collided in a way that still leaves historians in awe. What made this siege so extraordinary? Why do its stories continue to captivate us, even after hundreds of years? The answer lies in the 25 Chronicles we're about to explore, each one a testament to the human spirit, each one a thread in the tapestry of history that still resonates today. Think about the sheer scale of it all: a vast Ottoman army, one of the most formidable forces of its time, laying siege to a city that refused to bow. Inside those walls, ordinary people became heroes. Commanders made decisions that would shape the future, and alliances were forged in the heat of battle. But this isn't just a story of war. It's a story of resilience, of ingenuity, of moments so pivotal they changed the course of history. From the daring midnight raids to the unexpected twists of fate, these chronicles reveal the untold layers of a conflict that was as much about human determination as it was about swords and cannons. And here's the thing: these aren't just dusty old tales. They're alive with lessons that still matter. How did a handful of defenders hold out against impossible odds? What can we learn from the strategies that turned the tide? And why does this siege, above so many others, still inspire books, debates, and even films? As we journey through these 25 chronicles, you'll discover the answers, and perhaps even see a bit of yourself in the defiance of those who stood their ground. This is more than history. It's a legacy of courage that refuses to be forgotten. So let's step back into that pivotal moment where every decision, every act of bravery, and every stroke of luck came together to shape the world we know today. Marco da Viano wasn't just a monk, he was a force of nature. In the summer of 1683, as Vienna braced for the Ottoman onslaught, this humble Capuchin friar stepped onto the stage of history with a message so powerful it ignited the hearts of kings and commoners alike. His words weren't just sermons, they were rallying cries that cut through the political divisions of a fractured Europe. Imagine a continent torn by rivalries, where kingdoms rarely saw eye to eye, until one man's vision of unity gave them a purpose greater than themselves. What made da Viano's prophecy so compelling? He didn't just preach doom, he offered hope wrapped in urgency. Traveling from court to court, he spoke of a holy duty to defend Christendom, framing the siege not as a distant conflict but as a battle for the soul of Europe. His charisma was magnetic. Even Emperor Leopold I, a ruler known for his caution, was moved to action after hearing him. And it wasn't just about faith. Da Viano understood the power of symbolism. He carried a simple wooden crucifix, a stark reminder of what was at stake, turning diplomacy into a moral crusade. But here's the twist: his greatest weapon wasn't fear. It was unity. While the Ottomans relied on sheer numbers, da Viano's sermons wove alliances from thin air. The Bavarians, the Saxons, even the Poles who had long been at odds with the Habsburgs now marched under the same banner. This wasn't just military coordination, it was a psychological turning point. For the first time in decades, Europe acted as one, proving that shared belief could bridge even the deepest divides. And when the Winged Hussars charged at the decisive moment, it wasn't just cavalry striking the enemy, it was the living proof of da Viano's vision, his legacy. A lesson in leadership that transcends time. In an age of discord, he showed how conviction, paired with action, can alter the course of history. The siege could have been lost before it began, if not for a monk who believed words could be as mighty as swords. In the shadow of Vienna's towering walls, where the scent of gunpowder mixed with the aroma of fresh bread, an unlikely hero emerged, a baker named Jorg Franz Kolskitsky. While kings and commanders plotted grand strategies, it was this ordinary man who carried the weight of the city's survival on his shoulders. Disguised in Ottoman garb, speaking their language fluently, Kolskitsky did the unthinkable. He walked straight into the enemy camp, not to fight, but to listen. Night after night, he smuggled critical intelligence back to the defenders, scribbled notes hidden in loaves of bread or sewn into his clothing, his greatest coup. Intercepting the Ottomans' plan for a massive underground assault, the enemy had been tunneling beneath Vienna's defenses, preparing to plant explosives that would blow the city's walls wide open. Kolskitsky's warning gave the defenders just enough time to dig counter-tunnels, flooding the passages and thwarting the attack. Imagine the stakes: one misstep, one suspicious glance, and the entire operation would have collapsed. Yet he moved with the calm precision of a man who understood that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the will to act despite it. What makes Kolskitsky's story so extraordinary isn't just the risk he took, it's the humility with which he did it. Unlike the generals immortalized in oil paintings, he asked for no titles, no lands. His reward, a sack of coffee beans left behind by the fleeing Ottomans, which he used to open Vienna's first coffeehouse. From espionage to espresso, his legacy lives on in the most unexpected ways. This chronicle forces us to rethink how history is written. We celebrate the battles won by armies, but rarely the wars shaped by quiet, unseen hands. Kolskitsky's tale is a reminder that heroism wears many faces, sometimes even the flour-dusted face of a baker who chose to knead destiny into the dough of history. Without him, Vienna might have fallen long before the cavalry arrived. And that's the real lesson here. History doesn't just belong to those who shout the loudest, but to those who dare to whisper secrets that change the world. The ground shook as 12,000 hooves thundered across the Vienna plain. Not just horses, but a living storm clad in steel and leopard skins, their riders' wooden wings casting eerie shadows in the afternoon sun. This was no ordinary cavalry charge. The Polish Winged Hussars didn't just ride into battle, they descended like avenging angels, a spectacle so terrifying that Ottoman soldiers later swore the sky itself had cracked open. King Jan Sobieski's masterstroke wasn't just in their arrival, but in the agonizing patience that preceded it. For hours, his forces had held back on the Kollenberg heights, watching Vienna's smoke-choked skyline while the Ottomans exhausted themselves against the city's walls. Timing as much as terror won the day. What made their tactics revolutionary? The Hussars perfected the art of the feigned retreat, a maneuver so precise it danced on the edge of disaster. Early in the battle, a small contingent broke formation, luring Ottoman cavalry into pursuit before wheeling around to reveal the true trap: 3 staggered lines of lancers hidden behind them. This wasn't brute force, it was psychological warfare. The iconic wings strapped to their backs did more than create an unearthly whistling sound. They magnified the illusion of numbers, making 5,000 seem like 20,000. And when the final charge came, it wasn't a wild sprint but a controlled avalanche, their 6-meter lances splintering in unison like a single weapon wielded by a giant. Yet the real genius lay in what happened next. As the Ottoman ranks buckled, Sobieski did something no European commander had dared before. He ordered his cavalry straight into the enemy camp. While most victors would consolidate their gains, the Hussars understood that total rout required shattering not just armies, but morale. They galloped past tents still set for dinner, past the Sultan's abandoned war chest, all the way to the crimson pavilion of Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, who fled so hastily he left his ceremonial seal behind. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a spectacle designed to echo across empires. The charge's legacy endures not because it was the last great cavalry triumph, but because it redefined the possible. In an age where siege warfare favored patience over panache, the Hussars proved that audacity, when married to discipline, could overturn centuries of conventional wisdom. Their wings, often dismissed as mere ornamentation, became the ultimate bluff, a symbol that sometimes, to change history, you must first make yourself larger than life. By the 6th week of the siege, Vienna's cobblestone streets echoed with hunger. What began as rationed meals of hardened bread and thin broth had devolved into something far more desperate: families scraping mold from cellar walls, boiling shoe leather into a bitter gruel, and setting traps for rats that had become prized catches. The city's once bustling markets now displayed horrors: a single turnip traded for a silver spoon, a handful of grain exchanged for a family heirloom. Yet amid this slow unraveling of civilization's veneer, something remarkable emerged. The very people who might have turned on one another instead shared what little they had, forging bonds of solidarity that no Ottoman cannon could shatter. Consider the mechanics of such endurance. Without fresh supplies, the body consumes itself, muscle giving way to bone, energy draining like sand through an hourglass. But the mind, that was Vienna's true battleground. Citizens devised ingenious ways to stretch nothing into something, grinding acorns into flour, fermenting wallpaper paste for traces of nutrients, even distilling makeshift alcohol from rotten fruit to numb the pain. These weren't just acts of survival, they were quiet rebellions against despair. When the city's bakers ran out of grain, they baked siege bread from sawdust and crushed animal bones, a loaf so dense it could crack teeth, yet it kept hands busy and hope alive. The parallels to modern survival stories are uncanny. From the siege of Leningrad to the resilience of communities during natural disasters, history keeps proving a haunting truth: starvation doesn't just test the body. It exposes the core of who we are. In Vienna, the wealthy opened their wine cellars to the poor, knowing a shared drink might stave off madness. Children played games with pebbles, pretending they were sweets, while mothers whispered stories of feasts to come. Delusion, perhaps, but also defiance. What makes this chronicle unforgettable isn't the suffering itself, but the choices made within it. When a stray dog wandered into the city, half-starved and trembling, no one fought over it. Instead, they let it live, as if preserving one more life. Any life meant preserving their own humanity. That's the real lesson etched into Vienna's starving days. Resilience isn't just about enduring. It's about finding, even in the darkest hours, reasons to remain human. And sometimes those reasons are as simple as sharing a rat stew with a neighbor, or leaving the last crust of bread for someone weaker. The Ottomans had the numbers, the cannons, the tunnels, but they never accounted for the unbreakable calculus of a people who decided hunger wouldn't be the end of them. Beneath Vienna's beleaguered walls, where the earth trembled from cannon fire above, another battle raged in near silence, a war of shadows fought with pickaxes and whispered commands. The Ottomans' elite sapper corps, masters of underground warfare, had spent weeks carving a labyrinth of tunnels toward the city's foundations. Their plan was brutal in its simplicity: pack the chambers with black powder, ignite the fuse, and reduce Vienna's mighty defenses to rubble in a single, earth-shattering blast. But history often turns on moments no strategist can foresee. On the night of August 12, 1683, A miscalculation in soil density caused a critical tunnel to collapse prematurely, burying hundreds of the Sultan's finest engineers alive. The shockwave rippled far beyond that subterranean tomb. It bought Vienna's defenders 2 precious weeks. What fascinates historians isn't just the error itself, but the chain reaction it set off. Ottoman sappers were no amateurs. They'd breached countless fortresses from Candia to Baghdad. Their downfall came from something as mundane as an inaccurate map. The soil near Vienna's Berg bastion, where they'd concentrated their efforts, was laced with loose gravel from an ancient riverbed, unstable ground that required slower, reinforced tunneling. In their haste to break the city before relief forces arrived, the sappers ignored warning signs, creaking support beams, sudden trickles of sand where none should flow. When the collapse came, it wasn't just a tactical setback. It erased generations of specialized knowledge in an instant. The loss delayed subsequent attacks, allowing Sobieski's coalition critical time to unite. This chronicle forces us to confront history's hidden variables. We remember the Winged Hussars' thunderous charge, but rarely the anonymous engineer whose misplaced pickaxe altered empires. Modern parallels abound. A single software glitch derailing a Mars rover, a misread weather report changing the course of a hurricane evacuation. The siege reminds us that beneath every grand narrative lie countless tiny pivots, moments where skill bows to entropy, where preparation meets the unforeseeable. Yet there's an even deeper irony here. The Ottomans, renowned for their meticulous siegecraft, fell victim to the very precision they prized. Their tunnels were mathematical marvels, angled perfectly to avoid detection, but nature cares little for human calculations. In their obsession with perfect execution, they'd forgotten to account for Vienna's stubborn geology. Meanwhile, the city's defenders, though outmatched in engineering, adapted instinctively. When they heard distant collapses echoing through the ground, they didn't just reinforce walls, they dug countermines, flooding Ottoman passages with sewage-drenched water. The lesson: rigidity fails where flexibility endures. That fatal tunnel collapse wasn't just a historical footnote. It was a parable written in soil and blood, proof that even the mightiest plans can crumble beneath the weight of a single overlooked detail. And perhaps that's why this chronicle lingers, not as a tale of Ottoman failure, but as a humbling reminder that history's tides are shaped as much by human error as by human genius. While history books often paint the Siege of Vienna as a stage for kings and soldiers, the truth is far more textured and far more female. Behind every reloaded cannon, every bandaged wound, and every whispered word of encouragement stood women who refused to be mere bystanders in their city's darkest hour. Take Anna Kolbin, a merchant's widow whose name appears in no official military record, yet whose actions echo through survivor accounts. When the artillery crews faltered under relentless Ottoman fire, she led a group of women up the bastions, hauling powder sacks heavier than themselves, their skirts singed by sparks. They worked in shifts so precise that the rate of fire never slowed, a fact Ottoman scouts noted with confusion in their own logs. But their defiance wasn't limited to the ramparts. In the makeshift hospitals of St. Stephen's Cathedral, where the stench of gangrene clung to the air, women like Elizabeth Schmid reinvented battlefield medicine with whatever they had. No clean linen, they boiled tapestries stripped from noble homes. No anesthesia, they spooned honey into wounds to prevent infection, a folk remedy that, unbeknownst to them, held antibacterial properties. Their ingenuity rewrote the rules of triage, prioritizing the wounded not by rank, but by who could be saved. One diary entry describes Schmid performing an emergency amputation with a kitchen knife, her hands steady despite the screams echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Perhaps most striking was how these women weaponized invisibility. While men drew enemy attention on the walls, figures like their Jacolla moved unseen through Vienna's sewers, smuggling messages between cut-off battalions. Their knowledge of the city's hidden passages, learned from years of fetching water or delivering goods, became a tactical advantage. Even the Ottomans' famed intelligence network underestimated them, dismissing women as non-threats until it was too late. The real tragedy: these stories survived by accident, scribbled in margins of church ledgers or passed down as family lore. Official chroniclers of the time reduced them to footnotes, if they mentioned them at all. Yet their legacy forces us to ask, how many other sieges, how many other battles were won by hands history refused to name? The women of Vienna didn't just defend a city, they shattered the illusion that war has ever been a single-gender affair. And in doing so, they left a blueprint for courage that demands to be remembered. On the morning of September 8, 1683, the sky above Vienna darkened not with smoke, but with something far more unpredictable, a storm gathering with unnatural speed. Ottoman artillery crews, who had spent weeks methodically pounding the city's walls into rubble, suddenly found themselves scrambling to cover their most precious resource, gunpowder. But the rain came too fast, too violent. Within minutes, torrents of water seeped into storage pits, turning carefully stockpiled powder into useless sludge. The timing couldn't have been more devastating. Just as Kara Mustafa's forces prepared for their final, decisive assault, their cannons fell silent. To the desperate defenders peering through the downpour, it felt like deliverance. To the Ottomans, it was catastrophe wrapped in lightning. Historians still debate whether this was mere meteorological coincidence or something more profound. Whether records from the period suggest autumn storms weren't uncommon, but the precision of this one strains credulity. The downpour struck hardest precisely where the Ottomans had concentrated their artillery reserves near the Berg Ravelin, while leaving much of the city relatively dry. Even more striking, the storm coincided with the feast day of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary, a detail Vienna's clergy seized upon as evidence of divine favor. But skeptics point to a simpler explanation. The Ottomans, confident in their siege works, had stored powder in shallow pits to save time, ignoring standard precautions against dampness. Hubris, not heaven, may have been their undoing. The storm's aftermath reveals a deeper truth about warfare's unpredictability. Without dry powder, the Ottomans' vaunted siege guns, including massive bombards that could hurl 600-pound stones, were reduced to silent hulks. Their infantry, deprived of covering fire, faced enfilading shots from Vienna's suddenly emboldened defenders. But here's the twist: the rain also bought time for Sobieski's relief army, still days away. Nature, it seems, plays no favorites. It simply exposes which side prepared for chaos. This chronicle lingers not because it answers the question of divine intervention, but because it refuses to. In the fog of war, events take on meanings beyond facts. For the starving Viennese, the storm became a miracle. For the Ottomans, a cruel twist of fate. Yet both interpretations share a common thread: the recognition that history isn't just shaped by human hands, but by the uncontrollable forces that remind us how small even empires can be. When the last thunderclaps faded, all that remained was a single, indelible lesson: sometimes the weather writes the battle plan. The Ottoman officer's name was lost to history, but his confession echoes across centuries. Captured during a skirmish outside Vienna's crumbling walls, he wasn't some low-ranking foot soldier. He was a liaison to Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa himself, privy to troop deployments and attack timetables. At first, his interrogators expected nothing. Prisoners often lied or died silent. But this man broke in a way no one anticipated, not from torture, but from a single glimpse through a cellar window. the sight of Ottoman sappers accidentally shelling their own forward camp, a blunder that shattered his faith in their invincibility. What spilled forth wasn't just information, it was a detailed map of vulnerabilities whispered between sobs. The Janissaries' powder stores were undermanned after midnight. The Tatar auxiliaries quarreled over rations. The grand assault planned for September 10th would hinge on a feint toward the Berg Gate, while the real breach came from the Lerbel Bastion. Vienna's defenders faced a moral quicksand. Could they trust the word of a broken enemy? Commanders debated for hours, some arguing it was a ruse, others seeing divine providence in the timing. What tipped the scales was an unexpected voice, a Jesuit translator who noticed how the officer's dialect shifted when describing certain details, a linguistic fingerprint confirming he'd truly served in Mustafa's inner circle. The decision was made. They'd gamble their defenses on a traitor's tears. The aftermath reads like a paradox. While the officer's intelligence helped repel the September 10th assault, saving countless lives, his own fate remains murky. Some accounts claim he was quietly released into the countryside. Others insist he took his own life, unable to reconcile his betrayal. What's undeniable is how his story exposes war's gray morality. This wasn't a tale of heroic resistance or villainous deceit, but of a man caught between duty and despair, whose moment of weakness altered empires. Modern interrogators still study this episode, not for its tactics, but for its psychological revelation. Coercion rarely yields truth, but show a prisoner his own side's failures, and sometimes the floodgates open. The officer's confession reminds us that loyalty is fragile, and that the most pivotal intelligence often comes from the unlikeliest mouths. In the end, Vienna's saviors weren't just the hussars or the bakers, they were also the enemies who, willingly or not, handed them the keys to victory. Duke Charles of Lorraine moved through the candlelit halls of Passau Castle like a shadow, his footsteps silent but his presence undeniable. While Vienna burned under Ottoman cannon fire 200 miles east, the Duke was engaged in a different kind of warfare, one fought with whispered promises and carefully unspoken threats. The German princes gathered here weren't reluctant allies. They were outright skeptics, their coffers drained by decades of religious wars, their trust in Habsburg leadership thinner than the parchment of their treaties. Yet within 3 weeks, Charles turned their hesitation into commitment, securing 10,000 fresh troops without firing a single shot. His secret. He understood that diplomacy isn't about demands, it's about finding what each party fears to lose. Take the Elector of Saxony, who cared less about Vienna's survival than about protecting his lucrative Baltic trade routes. Charles didn't appeal to his piety or honor. He had spies leak fabricated Ottoman plans to seize Saxon merchant ships in the Black Sea. For the Bavarians, it was even simpler. Their ruling family's ancestral lands lay directly in the Ottoman path should Vienna fall. The Duke framed their participation not as charity, but as buying time to fortify their own borders. And then there was the matter of timing. By delivering each prince's agreement in staggered intervals, he created a domino effect. No one wanted to be the last holdout when their rivals had already pledged support. What historians often miss is how Charles weaponized ceremony. He knew these princes craved prestige as much as security, so he staged elaborate feasts where envoys accidentally overheard talk of other rulers' exaggerated contributions, sparking competitive generosity. The final masterstroke came when he persuaded Pope Innocent XI to backdate a proclamation branding the siege as a crusade, retroactively granting participants spiritual indulgences that eased Catholic-Protestant tensions just enough to cooperate. The legacy of these backroom deals rippled far beyond troop numbers. By binding disparate German states to a shared victory, Charles laid groundwork for the Holy League that would eventually push the Ottomans out of Hungary. His real triumph wasn't in the councils of Passau. but in proving that alliances built on mutual interest outlast those forged by idealism alone. While the Winged Hussars charged into legend, it was this duke's quill scratching across parchment late into the night that truly decided Vienna's fate. The Ottoman commanders knew their enemy's desperation could be their greatest weapon. As Vienna's defenders clung to their crumbling walls, a carefully orchestrated spectacle unfolded. Entire regiments of Janissaries suddenly breaking formation, their banners dipping in apparent panic, their retreat so convincing that even the dust seemed to flee with them. It was textbook deception, a maneuver honed over centuries of conquest. Lure the starving defenders beyond their fortifications, then annihilate them in the open field. But this time the script flipped. A Habsburg officer named Christoph von Starhemberg, his face still streaked with soot from a recent cannon blast, noticed something odd about the rout. The fleeing Ottomans weren't discarding weapons or shedding heavy armor. They moved with the disciplined cadence of men expecting to turn and fight. Von Starhemberg's decision in that moment reveals the razor's edge between brilliance and blunder in military deception. Instead of ordering a reckless pursuit, he played along, sending out a small, seemingly disorganized contingent of his own, raw recruits whose terror was all too real. As predicted, the Ottoman forces wheeled about, their traps sprung too soon, only to find themselves facing not Vienna's main force, but a feigned feint. The real counterstroke came from hidden positions along the city's outer ditches, where veteran grenadiers had lain in wait. What followed wasn't just a tactical victory, but a psychological earthquake. The Ottomans' elite troops, masters of psychological warfare, had been outmaneuvered at their own game. This chronicle peels back layers beyond mere battlefield tactics. The failed ruse exposed a fatal flaw in Kara Mustafa's leadership, his assumption that desperation would cloud Habsburg judgment. But starvation had sharpened Vienna's defenders, not dulled them. They'd grown attuned to the slightest inconsistencies, the timing of cannon volleys, the cadence of war drums, even the body language of fleeing soldiers. Modern psychologists might call it hypervigilance, that state where the mind notices patterns invisible to the well-fed. The aftermath rippled far beyond that afternoon. Ottoman commanders, their credibility shaken, grew hesitant to attempt complex maneuvers. Meanwhile, Vienna's defenders gained something priceless, proof their enemy wasn't invincible. That shift in perception fueled the resilience needed to hold out until Sobieski's arrival. The real lesson here: deception works only until the moment your opponent starts thinking like you. And sometimes, the hungrier they are, the clearer they see. High above Vienna's battered streets, where the smoke of cannon fire blurred the sky, an unexpected language cut through the chaos, the resonant toll of church bells. But these weren't the familiar calls to prayer or alarms of danger. They were something far more cunning, a cryptographic masterpiece disguised as sacred sound. Every sequence, every pause between peals carried hidden meaning, a lifeline woven into the city's very architecture. When the Ottomans severed Vienna's courier lines and jammed signal flags with smoke, the defenders turned to their oldest structures for their newest tricks. The bell towers of St. Stephen's and St. Michael's became nerve centers of an audacious communication network, their bronze voices speaking in ciphers only the desperate could decipher. The system's brilliance lay in its simplicity. 3 short rings followed by 2 long-meant reinforcements were needed at the Carinthian gate. A rapid alternating pattern between high and low bells signaled the discovery of another Ottoman tunnel. Even the intervals between strikes held significance. A pause of precisely 7 seconds indicated fresh water sources, while 3 seconds warned of approaching storm clouds that might dampen gunpowder. This wasn't just improvisation. It was a meticulously crafted lexicon, rehearsed in secret by teams of bell ringers who'd memorized dozens of permutations. And because the sound carried for miles, it reached places no runner could through barricaded alleys, over collapsed walls, even to the ears of scouts hiding beyond the siege lines. What fascinates modern cryptographers isn't just the code itself, but how it exploited Ottoman blind spots. The invaders, accustomed to European bell traditions, initially dismissed the irregular tolling as panic or disarray. By the time their interpreters realized the patterns were intentional, Vienna's defenders had already adapted, layering misdirection into the sequences. A bell that seemed to mark the hour might suddenly shift rhythm, its true message camouflaged within the ordinary. This psychological duel between those straining to hear order in the chaos and those crafting chaos to hide order marked one of history's earliest examples of signals warfare. The legacy of Vienna's bell code echoes in surprising places. Naval semaphore systems of the 18th century, Morse code's rhythmic dots and dashes, even modern emergency alert tones all owe a debt to those besieged ringers. But perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in the system's fragility. When Ottoman cannon fire finally silenced St. Michael's bells on September 4th, the city didn't mourn just the loss of sound, they grieved the severing of a collective nervous system. In that moment, Vienna learned a truth we still grapple with today. Communication isn't just about information. It's the thread that binds a people together when everything else is falling apart. And sometimes that thread is woven from something as simple as bronze and rope and human ingenuity. When the sun rose over Vienna's battered walls on the morning of September 11th, the defenders squinting through the smoke saw an unexpected sight, a line of soldiers marching under Habsburg banners, their accents thick with the brogues of Edinburgh and Dublin. These were the forgotten fighters of the siege, Scottish and Irish mercenaries, hundreds of whom had crossed continents to stand in Vienna's defense. Their presence shatters the myth of this conflict as a simple clash between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire. The truth, early modern warfare was a patchwork of alliances where faith and nationality mattered less than skill and pay. A Scottish Highlander might find himself fighting beside a Polish Hussar, while an Irish pikeman shared rations with a German grenadier, all bound not by flag but by the shared language of survival. Take Captain George Douglas, a seasoned Scottish veteran who'd cut his teeth in France's religious wars before offering his sword to the Habsburgs. His company of arquebusiers became infamous among Ottoman scouts for their deadly accuracy, their long-barreled weapons punching holes in cavalry charges with methodical precision. Then there's the enigmatic Irish Legion, a band of exiles whose knowledge of siege warfare honed in failed rebellions against English rule proved invaluable in countering Ottoman tunneling tactics. Their stories were deliberately erased from nationalist histories later written by victors, their contributions downplayed because they didn't fit the neat narrative of European unity. What makes their involvement so revealing isn't just their presence, but their motivations. Many weren't there for gold or glory. They were outcasts, religious dissenters, or soldiers of fortune with nowhere left to go. The Irish Catholic troops, for instance, saw Vienna as a chance to strike at Protestant England by proxy, while Scottish Presbyterians viewed the Ottomans as the ultimate other, against which all Christian factions could unite. This complex web of allegiances forces us to rethink how we define loyalty in war. Archaeology has only recently begun piecing together their full impact. Excavations near the Lerbel Bastion uncovered a cache of lead shot stamped with Gaelic lettering, while a Habsburg paymaster's ledger lists disbursements to a Captain O'Sullivan for extraordinary services during nocturnal engagements. These fragments hint at a truth textbooks omit. Vienna's survival depended as much on these mercenaries' grit as on the Winged Hussars' charge. Their legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places, from the bagpipe airs still played in Austrian folk music to the stubborn survival of Gaelic phrases in regimental nicknames centuries later. The real tragedy isn't that these men were forgotten. It's that their erasure perpetuates the myth of monolithic, nation-bound armies. The siege wasn't won by a single culture or creed, but by a ragged coalition of those who chose, for reasons noble or desperate, to stand together when it mattered most. And perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of all. History belongs not just to the celebrated, but to the strangers who answered the call when the world was crumbling. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa stood atop his silk-draped observation platform, gazing at Vienna's smoldering defenses through an ornate telescope, a gift from the Sultan himself. The city's walls were crumbling, its defenders reduced to shadows. Every military instinct screamed for one final, overwhelming assault. Yet day after day, the order never came. This hesitation, preserved in Ottoman War Council records and private correspondence, reveals a fatal flaw not of strategy, but of psychology. Mustafa wasn't just delaying, he was paralyzed by the specter of imperfection. Contemporary accounts describe a leader obsessed with symbolic victory. He insisted on taking Vienna intact, envisioning a grand procession through its gates where he'd present the city to Sultan, Mehmed IV like a jewel in a box. When his engineers proposed breaching multiple sections of wall to disperse defenders, he refused, fearing excessive damage would diminish his triumph. Even as his Janissary commanders urged all-out attacks, Mustafa micromanaged troop placements, shifting regiments like pieces on a chessboard long after the game demanded blunt force. The irony, his pursuit of flawless victory created the very conditions for disaster. The deeper tragedy lies in what historians uncovered centuries later: Mustafa's personal letters to Istanbul, dripping with barely concealed anxiety. Each dispatch inflated enemy casualties while downplaying Ottoman losses, crafting a narrative of inevitable conquest. This wasn't just propaganda, it was self-delusion. By the siege's critical midpoint, he'd boxed himself into a corner where anything less than total, bloodless surrender would appear as failure. Modern psychologists might diagnose this as the perfect storm of sunk cost fallacy and confirmation bias. He'd staked his reputation so completely on a specific outcome that alternative paths became unthinkable. Compare this to Sobieski's relentless pragmatism. The Polish king famously declared, "Better a battered city standing than a pristine one fallen," embracing tactical flexibility that Mustafa scorned. Where the Grand Vizier saw only two options: perfect victory or disgrace his adversaries, adapted hour by hour, turning setbacks into opportunities. Mustafa's hesitation gifted them something irreplaceable: time to regroup, to reinforce, to outmaneuver. The lesson transcends medieval warfare. From corporate boardrooms to political campaigns, Mustafa's ghost haunts every leader who mistakes stubbornness for strength. His fatal pause before Vienna's walls teaches us that in moments of crisis, the greatest risk isn't making the wrong choice, it's refusing to choose at all. History remembers decisive failures far more kindly than indecisive near successes, because at least the former moved the story forward. On the 42nd day of the siege, as Vienna's defenders chewed on boiled leather and counted ribs beneath their uniforms, a miracle arrived on creaking wagon wheels: 800 sacks of Bavarian rye, hauled through Ottoman patrols under cover of darkness. This wasn't just food, it was a tactical masterstroke disguised as flour. The shipment, orchestrated by Duke Maximilian II of Bavaria, had traversed 60 miles of enemy-held territory via a route so improbable even Kara Mustafa's scouts dismissed it as impossible. a network of dried-up riverbeds, abandoned quarry trails, and hunting paths known only to local woodsmen. Each sack bore the scars of that journey, torn by brambles, damp from forded streams, yet packed tight with enough calories to buy the city 5 more days. What makes this logistical feat extraordinary isn't just the distance covered, but the precision of its timing. The Bavarians had calculated exactly how much grain could move silently, no more than 12 wagons at a stretch, their wheels wrapped in rags to muffle sound. They'd studied Ottoman sentry rotations, noting the 90-minute window when cavalry patrols switched shifts near Tulln. Most crucially, they'd factored in human psychology. By sending small, intermittent convoys instead of one large caravan, they made each delivery appear insignificant, just another desperate peasant smuggling scraps. Only when the wagons reunited inside Vienna's gates did the full scale become clear. Enough rye to bake 60,000 loaves, each slice a silent rebuke to the Ottoman starvation strategy. The ripple effects transformed more than empty stomachs. Morale, which had plummeted as citizens resorted to eating cats and sparrows, surged overnight. Bakers who'd been conserving handfuls of sawdust now worked around the clock, turning the coarse Bavarian grain into dense, dark loaves that soldiers carried into battle like talismans. Even the act of distribution became a psychological weapon. The Ottomans, seeing smoke rise from Vienna's bakeries after weeks of stillness, realized their enemy had regained stamina. Modern military historians draw direct parallels to the Berlin airlift or the siege of Sarajevo, where control of supply lines meant the difference between defiance and collapse. Yet the deepest lesson lies in the grain's unintended legacy. Bavarian rye, tougher than local wheat, required longer fermentation, a quirk that led bakers to develop the precursor to modern sourdough. That tangy Vienna loaf, still baked today, carries within it the taste of desperation and ingenuity. Wars aren't just won on battlefields. They're won in the quiet moments when someone figures out how to move food through a noose of enemies, when a single shipment of flour becomes the thread that keeps a city's heart beating. The Ottomans had cut roads, burned fields, and poisoned wells, but they couldn't sever the invisible chains of loyalty stretching across Europe, link by link, all the way to a Bavarian duke who refused to let a city starve. Among the smoke and rubble of Vienna's collapsing walls, where seasoned soldiers faltered under the weight of exhaustion, an unexpected force emerged: children. Not as bystanders but as combatants, civic ledgers from 1683 list them simply as the young defenders, but their ages tell a starker story. Boys as young as 12, some orphaned by the siege itself, others apprentices separated from their masters in the chaos. They didn't wear uniforms, just tattered work clothes cinched with rope, their weapons cobbled together from butcher knives, blacksmith tongs, and broken pikes. When the Ottomans breached the Corinthian gates' outer defenses on September 5th, it was these children who formed human chains to haul buckets of boiling pitch to the parapets, their small hands blistering as they poured death onto attackers below. The details preserved in church registries are hauntingly specific. A 14-year-old cooper's apprentice named Matthias Weber led a group of 20 others to plug a gap in the Lerbel bastion with furniture and rubble, their bodies forming a living barricade until reinforcements arrived. A girl barely in her teens, Anna Schuster, organized a network of messenger runners after noticing Ottoman scouts couldn't distinguish between children playing and military movements. Her team darted through alleys with coded notes tucked into their shoes. These weren't isolated acts, they were a systematic mobilization of the young and desperate, a phenomenon so widespread that commanders later admitted the city might have fallen without them. What chills the blood isn't just their bravery, but the bureaucratic matter of factness with which Vienna recorded their sacrifices. Payroll sheets show children receiving half wages for combat service, while guild ledgers note apprentices killed in action with the same detached tone as broken tools. This wasn't medieval sentimentality. It was a society so strained by war that youth became just another resource to expend. Yet buried in those dry documents are flashes of aching humanity. A scribbled note about a boy who cried for his mother while holding a breach alone, or the account of two brothers who traded places in the fighting line so one could rest. Modern parallels sting with uncomfortable clarity. From the teenage Volkssturm units of Nazi Germany's collapse to the child soldiers of contemporary African conflicts, Vienna's children force us to confront an ugly truth: when civilizations fracture, the young are both shields and casualties. But there's another layer here, often overlooked. These children weren't passive victims. Their actions reveal a fierce, almost rebellious agency. They formed their own chains of command, invented tactics suited to their size, like slipping through Ottoman siege lines to steal food, and in some cases, outright disobeyed orders to retreat. A diary from a Jesuit priest describes finding a group of them defiantly singing folk songs in a collapsed tunnel, their voices rising through the darkness like a challenge. The cruelest irony: many who survived the siege perished in its aftermath. With no families left, they vanished into the alleys or succumbed to wounds that would have been treatable had medicine not been rationed for soldiers. Their legacy lingers in Vienna's folk memory: ghost stories about small, soot-stained figures seen near the old battlements, or the tradition of leaving bread rolls at certain gateways on the siege anniversary. These weren't just tragic footnotes, they were the inheritors of a world they helped save, even as it failed to save them. And perhaps that's why this chronicle cuts deepest, not because children fought, but because their fight reminds us how easily societies normalize the unthinkable when survival hangs in the balance. The ink smudged under his trembling fingers as Janos, a Hungarian conscript in the Ottoman army, scrawled his final entry by firelight: 3 days without bread. The stench of the dead chokes us. When the officers sleep, I go. His diary, discovered years later in a roadside ditch, was one of dozens that revealed a truth historians often overlook: the siege of Vienna wasn't just fought by those who stood their ground, but by those who slipped away into the night. Desertion wasn't a footnote in this conflict. It was a silent epidemic that gnawed at both armies, exposing the raw human instinct to survive when honor rings hollow. The numbers stagger even now. Ottoman payroll records show entire units evaporating overnight, some Janissaries abandoning their posts to blend into the countryside, others drowning in the Danube during desperate escapes. On the Habsburg side, garrison logs note men vanishing from the ramparts, their uniforms found folded neatly beside loopholes as if they dissolved into the smoke. But what makes these departures so revealing are the personal accounts left behind. A Bavarian drummer boy's journal describes stealing a dead comrade's boots to walk home, only to be haunted by the man's face in every village churchyard. An Ottoman sapper's letter to his mother, never sent, confesses he'd rather face execution than bury another friend collapsed from exhaustion in their own tunnel. These weren't cowards. Many had fought bravely for months before breaking. The difference: at Vienna, desertion became a mathematical certainty. Soldiers on both sides faced the same grim calculation: stay and die for a cause that might already be lost, or flee and live with consequences that could destroy their families. Some Ottoman deserters, if caught, found their entire villages back home taxed into ruin as collective punishment. Habsburg runaways, if identified, risked having their names nailed to church doors as traitors. Yet still they ran not toward freedom, but toward the slim chance of a life barely worth living. The most haunting stories, though, are the deserters who couldn't desert at all. Diaries from the siege's final weeks describe men deliberately wounding themselves to be sent to the rear, or feigning madness by babbling in languages no one understood. One Habsburg soldier even ground glass into his porridge to induce illness, preferring agony to the front lines. Their actions force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. When pushed beyond human limits, loyalty becomes a luxury few can afford. What lingers isn't judgment but empathy. These accounts rewrite the siege narrative, reminding us that for every trumpet blast of glory, there were 100 whispered goodbyes in the dark. The deserter's legacy isn't one of shame. It's a mirror held up to the brutality of war itself, where the real moral failing wasn't in those who fled, but in the systems that made flight the only sane choice. Their diaries, stained with sweat and tears, ask us a question we still struggle to answer. How much can we fairly demand of anyone before breaking becomes not an act of weakness, but of unbearable wisdom? Amid the smoke and screams of Vienna's desperate defense, a lone figure moved with deliberate calm. Not a soldier, not a priest, but a court painter named Jorg Stubenburg. While others clutched weapons, he gripped charcoal sticks, his sketchbook filling not with battle plans, but with the raw humanity of a city under siege. His drawings, long overshadowed by grand oil paintings of the conflict, reveal something far more precious than propaganda, the unvarnished truth of survival. In one fragile sketch, a group of women huddle around a makeshift oven, their faces hollowed by hunger but their hands steady as they knead sawdust into dough. In another, a Janissary prisoner shares a pipe with his Habsburg captor, their temporary truce etched in shared exhaustion. These weren't just scenes, they were stolen moments of tenderness in a world gone mad. Stubenberg's genius lay in his outsider's eye. As Emperor Leopold's official artist, he could have confined himself to heroic portraits of commanders. Instead, he wandered the barricades like a ghost, capturing details too mundane for historians yet too vital to forget. A shoeless drummer boy tightening his drumhead with scraps of gut, an elderly nun distributing bullet molds to soldiers, even the way sunlight filtered through cannon smoke to gild the cathedral's spire. His quick, unpolished strokes preserved the siege's emotional cadence, the eerie quiet before dawn assaults, the sudden bursts of laughter in overcrowded cellars, the way strangers' shoulders touched when sleep finally claimed them. What makes these sketches revolutionary isn't their artistry, but their honesty. Official accounts spoke of gallant charges and noble sacrifices. Stubenberg showed the blistered hands loading those charges, the blood-stained bandages reused until they disintegrated. His most controversial work, The Powder Grinders, depicted children, their faces aged beyond years, crushing saltpeter with mortar and pestle, their tiny lungs filled with toxic dust. The court tried to suppress it, fearing morale would collapse if the public saw such truths. Yet these very images now serve as the siege's most authentic testament, cutting through centuries of myth-making. The irony, Stubenberg nearly vanished from history. His sketches, deemed unimportant next to grand battle panoramas, were stuffed into archive boxes until rediscovered in the 1930s. Curators realized with shock that his work didn't just document events, it preserved the emotional frequencies of trauma and resilience that written records couldn't convey. Modern psychologists study his drawings of soldiers' thousand-yard stares, recognizing the same shell-shocked expressions seen in photographs of Verdun or Fallujah. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies in what Stubenberg chose not to draw. Unlike later romantic artists, he avoided dramatizing death. His focus stayed stubbornly on the living, their cracked lips, their improvised tools, their silent embraces. In doing so, he gave us a rare gift, not a story of faceless armies, but of individuals who laughed, wept, and endured. That's why his sketches still resonate today. They remind us that history isn't written only in treaties and troop movements, but in the creases of a shared loaf of bread, in the way a stranger's hand might steady yours when the world is falling apart. Art, it turns out, can be the most truthful chronicler of all, not despite its imperfections, but because of them. Fear travels faster than any army, and in Vienna's sweltering August heat, it took only a whisper to ignite panic. The wells are poisoned. By midday, the rumor had mutated into grotesque certainty. Ottoman saboteurs had crept into the city under cover of darkness, dumping arsenic and dead rats into every water source. Never mind that Vienna's physicians found no trace of poison in the sick who collapsed at fountains. Never mind that the few captured Ottoman soldiers laughed when interrogated about the plot, insisting their own troops suffered worse thirst. The lie had already taken root, fed by paranoia and the very real desperation of a city where water was more precious than gold. What makes this episode so chilling isn't just the falsehood itself, but how it reshaped behavior. Terrified citizens abandoned communal wells, risking dehydration rather than drink from suspect buckets. Mothers traded their last scraps of bread for murky puddle water believed to be safe. The Habsburg command, recognizing the crisis, posted guards at cisterns not to prevent poisoning, but to stop fights over access. Meanwhile, the real threat went unchecked. Dysentery from overcrowded cellars and unburied waste, a scourge deadlier than any phantom toxin. Historians still debate the rumor's origins. Some point to a misunderstood incident where a delirious soldier vomited into a well after eating spoiled meat. Others blame Kara Mustafa's psychological warfare, though Ottoman records show no such orders. The most plausible explanation, a perfect storm of stress and suggestion. When people are pushed to the edge, their minds cling to explanations that offer both a villain and a solution. Poison provided both, a clear enemy to blame and an avoidable threat, unlike the inescapable grind of starvation and cannon fire. The legacy of Vienna's poisoned wells extends far beyond the siege. It's a cautionary tale about how easily fear distorts reality, a pattern repeating through history from the witch trials of Salem to modern conspiracy theories. Yet there's an unexpected twist in this story. The panic forced Vienna's leaders to innovate, digging emergency wells in hidden courtyards, boiling water rigorously, even distilling alcohol for sterilization. These measures, born of misinformation, saved countless lives from real diseases. Sometimes the stories we tell in darkness lead us, however clumsily, toward light. This chronicle doesn't just expose how lies spread. It reveals a deeper truth. In moments of crisis, people don't just fear death, they fear the loss of control. And sometimes a fictional narrative feels more manageable than chaos. The poisoned wells of Vienna remind us that history isn't just written by the victors, but by the terrified, the desperate, and those who would rather believe a lie than face the unbearable randomness of survival. The Janissaries stood shoulder to shoulder in the gathering dusk, their polished breastplates smeared with mud and blood, their famed discipline holding just long enough to form one final square. These were no ordinary soldiers, they were the Sultan's own, raised from childhood to be the sharpest blade in the Ottoman Empire. Yet here, on the outskirts of Vienna, they found themselves cornered, their backs to the Danube, their legendary invincibility crumbling like the dirt beneath their boots. What happened in those chaotic hours reveals a haunting truth about elite warriors. The very traits that make them formidable can become their undoing when the tide turns against them. Consider the Janissaries' training. For centuries, they'd been the empire's backbone, drilled to perfection in synchronized volleys and razor-sharp maneuvers. But that precision came at a cost: rigidity. When Sobieski's Winged Hussars broke their lines, the Janissaries didn't scatter like common troops might. Instead, they fell back on rehearsed formations that no longer matched the chaos around them. Eyewitness accounts describe them methodically reloading their muskets while Polish lancers tore into their flanks, their discipline so ingrained it became a liability. Modern military theorists call this the expertise trap, when over-reliance on practiced skills blinds soldiers to improvisation. The real tragedy, though, wasn't their fighting prowess, it was their psychology. Janissaries weren't just trained, they were indoctrinated. Their identity was inseparable from victory, so when defeat became inevitable, something inside them shattered. Contemporary diaries describe surreal scenes, officers calmly cleaning their weapons amid carnage, as if maintaining routine could undo reality. Squads refusing to retreat even when ordered, choosing annihilation over the shame of survival. This wasn't cowardice, it was the unraveling of men who'd never been taught how to lose. Archaeological evidence adds a chilling layer. Excavations near the battle site unearthed Janissary bodies still clutching empty powder horns, their bones arranged in neat ranks, as if they'd knelt together for a final volley that never came. Nearby, historians found something even more telling: discarded talismans and hastily scribbled prayers tucked into uniform linings. These weren't the relics of fearless automatons, but of terrified humans grasping for comfort when their myth of invincibility failed them. The lesson here transcends time. From Napoleon's old guard at Waterloo to modern special forces units, elite troops share this paradox. Their excellence makes them brittle under pressure. Vienna's Janissaries remind us that no amount of training can prepare a soldier for the moment their purpose collapses, and perhaps that's why their last stand lingers in memory, not as a failure but as a mirror. Their end forces us to ask, what happens when the best of the best discover they're only human after all? As the Ottoman forces withdrew from Vienna's broken gates, their wagons groaned under an unexpected cargo, not just weapons or supplies, but hundreds of leather-bound manuscripts, their gilt-edged pages flashing in the autumn sun like stolen sunlight. Among them were irreplaceable treasures: illuminated Bibles painstakingly crafted by monks, star charts drawn from the observations of Arab astronomers, even a rare copy of Tacitus' Annals annotated by Erasmus himself. This wasn't random plunder, it was a systematic erasure of knowledge, a silencing of voices that had echoed through Vienna's universities and scriptoriums for generations. The Ottomans, no strangers to the power of the written word, understood better than most that to conquer a people, you must first dispossess them of their stories. Yet the fate of these texts is far more complex than simple theft. Some, like the Codex Vindobonensis, eventually resurfaced in Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, where Ottoman scholars pored over their pages with genuine curiosity. Others vanished into private collections or were bartered away during the chaotic retreat, their journeys tracing a shadow map of war's aftermath. One Persian medical treatise, looted from Vienna's Hofburg Library, later turned up in a Cairo bazaar, its margins filled with Ottoman field doctors' notes, proof that even in exile, these books continued to teach, to heal, to transcend the conflicts that had uprooted them. The real tragedy lies in what never returned: a 12th century anthology of troubadour poetry, last seen tied to a mule's saddle, held the only surviving verses of a dozen medieval poets. Its loss didn't just deprive Vienna, it severed humanity's connection to an entire artistic tradition. Modern scholars still pore over inventories from the siege, clinging to the faint hope that these manuscripts might yet languish undiscovered in some forgotten attic or mosque archive. The hunt for them has become its own kind of archaeology, one where every clue, a dealer's receipt, a traveler's diary mention, carries the weight of a cipher. This chronicle forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. War doesn't just destroy bodies and buildings, it unravels the very fabric of memory. Those looted books were more than objects. They were vessels of identity, of collective thought. Their absence left gaps in Vienna's intellectual lineage, like missing teeth in a smile. Yet there's a paradox here too, because the Ottomans' act of appropriation also wove these works into new narratives. A Greek psalter taken from Vienna became a language primer for Ottoman diplomats. A German herbal, packed between saddlebags, found its way to a Damascus apothecary, where its remedies saved lives under foreign skies. Perhaps the ultimate lesson lies in the resilience of ideas themselves. Even as empires rise and fall, words have a way of outlasting their captors. The story of Vienna's lost library isn't just one of loss, it's a testament to the stubborn, unkillable nature of knowledge. Those manuscripts may have been carried off as trophies, but they refused to become silent. Instead, they whispered across borders, turning conquerors into students and looters into unlikely custodians of the very culture they sought to claim. Beneath the thunder of cannons and the cries of wounded men, another battle raged in absolute secrecy, one fought with ink and whispered promises rather than steel. In the dim glow of candlelit tents, Ottoman envoys and Habsburg representatives passed notes through intermediaries, testing the waters for a peace that might spare both empires the butcher's bill of total war. The most tantalizing of these offers came in late August 1683, when Kara Mustafa himself allegedly proposed lifting the siege in exchange for Vienna's symbolic submission and a yearly tribute. The Habsburgs, their city crumbling but their pride unbroken, countered with a shameless bluff. They claimed Sobieski's relief army was already crossing the Danube, a fiction bolstered by carefully staged troop movements. What's astonishing isn't that these negotiations failed, it's how seriously both sides considered them before pulling back from the brink. The draft terms, preserved in a Milanese archive, read like alternate history. The Ottomans would withdraw with honors intact, keeping strategic forts in Hungary while publicly declaring Vienna too formidable to assault. In return, Emperor Leopold would tacitly acknowledge Ottoman supremacy in the Balkans and turn a blind eye to raids along the border. It was a face-saving solution for both sides, crafted by diplomats who understood the real cost of stubbornness. So why did it collapse? The answer lies in a single, unspoken word: momentum. By late summer, too many soldiers had died, too many reputations had been staked on victory. Kara Mustafa couldn't return to Istanbul without conquest, and Leopold couldn't explain concessions to a populace that had eaten rats to hold the line. What makes these failed talks so revealing are the private doubts they expose. A Habsburg chamberlain's diary confesses that Leopold's inner circle debated the offer for 3 agonizing days, weighing the city's survival against the empire's prestige. Meanwhile, Ottoman payroll records showed Janissaries receiving unscheduled bonuses, a desperate bid to maintain loyalty as rumors of peace spread. The tragedy here isn't just that diplomacy failed, but that it came so close to succeeding before fear and pride intervened. Modern conflict resolution experts point to this moment as a textbook case of entrapment, where leaders become so invested in their chosen path they'd rather escalate than admit miscalculation. Perhaps the most poignant artifact is a cipher letter from the Habsburg envoy, its edges frayed from frantic handling. "We have them at the table," he wrote before adding in a shaky postscript, "God forgive us, but I believe they want this ended more than we do." That fragile hope that both sides were secretly yearning for an exit shatters the myth of inevitable bloodshed. The siege didn't have to end with Sobieski's charge or Mustafa's flight. It could have ended with handshakes and face-saving lies, sparing thousands. These buried negotiations force us to confront war's greatest paradox. Sometimes peace fails not because it's impossible, but because it arrives too late to undo the stories we've already told ourselves about who we are and what we must fight for. Vienna's untaken exit ramp lingers as a ghost in the archives, whispering that history isn't just shaped by the battles that happened, but by the ones we refused to walk away from. Captain Albrecht von Herbstein's quill scratched across the page long after midnight, the ink blotting where his tears had fallen. "I wake to their faces," he wrote in a memoir hidden beneath his floorboards for decades. Hans, with his laughter cut short by that cannonball, young Friedrich who begged me to carry his mother's rosary home, their voices grow louder the longer I survive. His words, unearthed in a Vienna attic 2 centuries later, reveal a truth rarely spoken of in heroic chronicles. The siege didn't end when the Ottomans fled. For men like von Herbstein, it seeped into their bones, a war waged nightly behind closed eyelids. What makes his account so unsettlingly modern is its clinical precision. He describes symptoms we now recognize as classic PTSD, the way certain smells triggered violent tremors, how church bells mimicking alarm signals sent him crouching for cover years later. One passage details a hauntingly familiar cycle: weeks of numbness shattered by intrusive flashbacks, guilt over meals eaten while comrades starved, even a failed attempt to return his Medal of Valor, whispering to the Emperor's envoy that honor felt like theft from the dead. His physician's notes, discovered folded inside the diary, diagnose melancholia of the soul, prescribing prayer and cold bath remedies as powerless as whispers against a storm. The tragedy deepens when we trace von Herbstein's post-war years. Promoted to command a garrison in Graz, he became notorious for refusing to drill troops near churchyards where cannon fire might disturb the buried. His subordinates' letters describe a man who stockpiled rations long after peace returned, once striking a cook who discarded moldy bread. These weren't eccentricities, they were the survival instincts of a psyche forever trapped in 1683. Modern psychologists would recognize his hypervigilance and hoarding as textbook trauma responses, but in his era, such behaviors merely earned him the nickname the Ghost Major. Yet within his anguish lies an unexpected legacy: von Herbstein's meticulous records of fallen comrades, not just their ranks and deaths, but their pre-war lives as cobblers, fathers, amateur poets became the foundation for Vienna's first Veterans Relief Fund. His lists, originally compiled to assuage his guilt, allowed widows to claim pensions and orphans to find apprenticeships. In a cruel twist, the very trauma that isolated him became a lifeline for hundreds. This chronicle forces us to confront war's longest shadow. We measure battles in territories gained or lost, but von Herbstein's trembling handwriting measures something far more intimate: the weight of breathing when others cannot. His story bridges centuries, proving that the wounds we call modern understandings of trauma have always existed. They just wore different names: battle fatigue, soldier's heart, the 1,000-yard stare. The siege's real toll wasn't just in shattered walls, but in the silent fractures of those who walked away, carrying worlds of ghosts in their ribcage. And perhaps that's why his memoir still whispers to us today, not as a relic but as a mirror. The story goes like this: as Kara Mustafa's forces retreated in disarray, they abandoned sacks of dark, aromatic beans, coffee, a treasure far more precious than gold to the Ottomans. Enter Jorg Franz Kolskitsky, our fearless baker spy, who claimed the beans as his reward and opened Vienna's first coffeehouse, forever changing the city's culture. It's a delicious tale steeped in poetic justice, the spoils of war transforming into cups of steaming melange. But like so many legends, the truth is messier and far more interesting. Digging into archival records reveals a different brew. Coffee had already trickled into Vienna through trade routes decades before the siege, though it remained a curiosity confined to aristocratic circles. The real shift came not from abandoned sacks, but from the sudden influx of diplomats, merchants, and refugees who fled Ottoman-held territories after the siege, bringing their coffee rituals with them. Armenian traders, in particular, played a pivotal role. Records from 1685 list a certain Johannes der Dotto, an Armenian immigrant, as the first licensed coffee vendor in Vienna, predating Kolskitsky's alleged debut. So why does the myth persist? Because it mirrors the deeper truth of cultural exchange hidden beneath the siege's violence. The Ottomans may not have literally left coffee behind, but their influence seeped into Vienna's pores. The Viennese didn't just adopt coffee, they reinvented it. Where Ottoman coffee was thick, bitter, and served in tiny cups, Vienna's version softened the edges with milk and honey, served in porcelain with a side of gossip and newspapers. The coffeehouse became a democratic space, a world away from the taverns where beer had long ruled. In that sense, the legend isn't entirely wrong. It just romanticizes a slower, richer process of transformation. The real magic of this chronicle lies in what it reveals about how history gets distilled. We crave tidy origin stories, moments where the past pivots on a single event. But more often, change simmers quietly, blending accident and intention. Vienna's coffee culture wasn't born from a sack of beans. It was brewed from war, migration, and the human knack for finding comfort even in the aftermath of chaos. And perhaps that's the most intoxicating truth of all. Sometimes the myths we cling to tell us more about who we want to be than how we actually got here. Beneath Vienna's modern streets, where tourists now sip coffee in sunlit squares, the earth still holds its darkest secret. In 2018, construction workers near the Guadal district struck bone, not the isolated skeleton of some forgotten soldier, but a tangled mass of limbs stretching deeper than their excavators could reach. This was no orderly burial. The bodies lay haphazardly, some curled protectively around children, others with hands still clutching makeshift weapons or rosaries. Radiocarbon dating confirmed what historians feared. These were victims of the 1683 siege, a silent counterpoint to the triumphant frescoes lining Vienna's churches. The numbers stagger the imagination. Initial surveys suggest over 2,000 individuals crammed into a space no larger than a tennis court, their remains bearing the unmistakable marks of urban catastrophe, fractures from collapsing buildings, pockmarks of shrapnel, even the telltale grooves of teeth worn down by chewing leather during starvation. But what chills archaeologists most isn't the scale of death. It's the intimate violence etched into these bones. One skeleton, identified as a young woman by her pelvic structure, was found with a sewing needle still embedded between her ribs, suggesting she'd been mending clothes when a cannonball reduced her home to rubble. Another cluster showed mothers shielding infants, their bones fused together by centuries of compacted soil. These graves force us to confront the sanitized myths woven into victory narratives. Official Habsburg accounts spoke of 6,000 brave defenders lost, but said nothing of the 20,000 civilians who likely perished starved, crushed, or buried alive in their own cellars. Forensic anthropologists have identified entire families wiped out in single blasts, their remains still huddled around the cookpots where they'd boiled their last meal of wallpaper paste and rats. The disparity between record and reality reveals a brutal truth. History favors the stories of those who survived to write it. Modern technology peels back layers even the dead couldn't share. Isotope analysis of teeth enamel traces some victims' origins to as far away as Bavaria and Bohemia, refugees who'd fled to Vienna seeking safety, only to meet a crueler fate. DNA recovered from a child's femur matched with living descendants in Lower Austria, rewriting family trees that had assumed ancestors died in later conflicts. Each skeleton becomes a palimpsest, its scars narrating moments no chronicle recorded. The butcher who kept working despite a broken arm, the teenager whose spine showed signs of hauling cannonballs before his growth plates had fully formed. The most haunting discovery, these weren't all hasty wartime burials. Some pits showed signs of systematic organization, bodies arranged in rows with coins over their eyes, suggesting a desperate attempt to maintain dignity amid chaos. A few even contained personal effects slipped between the dead: a locket with a miniature portrait, a carpenter's folded measuring stick, a schoolboy's slate scratched with half-finished multiplication tables. These quiet acts of remembrance, performed by survivors who themselves might have perished days later, blur the line between mass grave and memorial. What emerges isn't just a correction to the historical record, but a moral reckoning. For centuries, the siege was framed as a glorious turning point where civilization triumphed over barbarism. The bones tell a different story of ordinary people caught between empires, their suffering rendered invisible by the very victory they helped purchase. As archaeologists painstakingly catalogue each fracture and artifact, they're doing more than studying the past. They're returning voices to the voiceless, one shattered ribcage at a time. And perhaps that's the siege's most enduring lesson. True courage isn't just found in the charge of hussars, but in the quiet resilience of those who had no choice but to endure. When the last Ottoman banners vanished beyond the horizon in September 1683, Europe didn't just breathe a sigh of relief, it began rewriting the rules of power itself. The siege's aftermath birthed something far more enduring than battlefield legends. A blueprint for collective security that echoes in NATO summit rooms and United Nations chambers to this day. The Holy League, formed in Vienna's shadow, wasn't merely a temporary alliance to repel invaders. It became the first true multinational defense pact, where rivals like Poland and the Habsburgs set aside generations of mistrust because they grasped a radical truth: some threats transcend borders. Take the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, where Ottoman and European diplomats redrew the map not through conquest, but negotiation. For the first time, a declining empire accepted terms not as surrender, but as a calculated retreat to preserve stability. The precedent set here, that great powers could lose battles without collapsing into chaos, still underpins modern conflict resolution. When diplomats speak of off-ramps for adversaries today, they're channeling the same pragmatism that kept the Ottomans at the negotiating table despite their wounded pride. But the siege's deepest legacy lies in its unintended consequences. Vienna's defense drained Habsburg coffers, forcing them to share influence with German principalities and Hungarian nobles, an early lesson in the limits of unilateral power. Meanwhile, the Ottomans' failure sparked internal reforms that ultimately modernized their military and bureaucracy. This paradox, where defeat breeds adaptation and victory sows complacency, plays out in contemporary geopolitics. Think of how the Cold War's end left NATO searching for purpose, while Russia's humiliation fueled its 21st century revanchism. The most striking parallel, though, emerges in the siege's cultural aftermath. Just as Vienna's coffeehouses became melting pots where former enemies exchanged ideas, modern Europe's strength springs from its ability to transform old battlefields into shared spaces. The EU's Schengen zone, where borders once bloodied by war now blur into unity, owes a quiet debt to those who proved cooperation could outlast conflict. Even the siege's darkest chapters, like the scapegoating of Vienna's Jewish community amid post-war paranoia, serve as cautionary tales for how quickly solidarity can fracture along old fault lines. Perhaps the ultimate testament to 1683's diplomatic legacy is how its lessons adapt. When cyber attacks replace cannonades and economic sanctions stand in for blockades, the core principle remains: security is a mosaic, not a monolith. The Holy League's members would scarcely recognize today's geopolitical chessboard, but they'd understand instinctively the delicate dance of deterrence and dialogue that keeps it from tipping into chaos. That's why historians still pore over moldy treaties from the siege aftermath, not as relics, but as mirrors reflecting the enduring truth that no empire, no matter how mighty, can stand alone against the tides of change. From prophecies to poisoned wells, these 25 chronicles unravel the siege of Vienna not as a distant battle, but as a living, breathing collision of human choices, each one rippling across centuries to shape the world we know today. What makes these stories endure isn't just the thunder of cannons or the flash of sabers, but the quiet moments in between, the baker scribbling notes in the dark, the monk whose words moved armies, the children who became soldiers before they'd grown into their own shoes. History at its heart is made of people who laughed, feared, betrayed, and triumphed in ways that still echo through time. Think about how these chronicles rewrite the traditional narrative of the siege. It wasn't just Sobieski's cavalry or Vienna's walls that turned the tide. It was the Ottoman officer who broke under the weight of his own army's mistakes. It was the Bavarian Rye that arrived in the nick of time, not because of luck, but because someone remembered an old quarry path. It was the women grinding sawdust into bread, the mercenaries fighting for causes not their own, the artists sketching truth in the margins of war. These aren't footnotes, they're the hidden gears that made history turn. And here's the thing, the siege didn't truly end in 1683. Its legacy pulses through our world in ways we rarely stop to notice. Every time we sip a cup of coffee, we're tasting the cultural exchange born from conflict. Every time diplomats negotiate rather than march to war, they're walking a path first carved by those uneasy peace talks in the shadow of Vienna's walls. Even the way we document trauma, from von Herbstein's trembling diary to modern veteran support networks, traces back to those who carried the siege scars long after the banners were folded away. So as we close this chapter, I'll leave you with a question, not just about which chronicle resonated most, but why. Was it the ingenuity of the Bell Code, the tragedy of the mass graves, or the audacity of the Winged Hussars? Each of us connects to history differently, and that's the beauty of these stories. They're not relics behind glass. They're mirrors reflecting our own struggles, triumphs, and capacity to endure. Hit pause and think, which moment from the siege would you carry forward? Because history isn't just something we study, it's something we continue to live. Drop your thoughts below and let's keep the conversation alive. And if you've enjoyed this journey through time, don't forget to subscribe. There are countless more stories waiting to be told, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of our shared past.